Mark Urban is now with us, as he is every Monday, to talk us through the big foreign policy, diplomatic and defence stories, and what a week to have him. Hello, Mark.
Morning.
Welcome back. Great to have you with us. Look, today is obviously a huge day for the war in Ukraine, with Volodymyr Zelensky meeting Donald Trump at the White House, supported by European leaders, including Keir Starmer. Mark, just to understand what's fundamentally going on here, the meeting last week in Alaska didn't seem at the time to have achieved anything in particular at all, and yet now everyone seems to be behaving as if it created this great sort of momentum towards something. Is this real, or is this just noise? I know that's a question I ask a lot.
Well, it's a good question. Well, I think it's interesting. Some commentators are talking up today's White House meetings as a sort of defining point in post-war history. I mean, really giving it that kind of emphasis. It's possible, but I think, like you, I have a certain amount of skepticism born of watching Trump in action before. And also, let's face it, the underlying issue that they're trying to deal with here, which is Russia's desire to sort of crush Ukraine's independence, it's a big and complex issue and not necessarily amenable to a quick Oval Office spray, you know, where cameras are running and people talk at one another. So it's important. I think the thing that came out of Helsinki that brought everybody up in Europe was this idea that, having gone into the meeting saying that there had to be a ceasefire, this is Trump saying there had to be a ceasefire, and, you know, he was ready to bash Russia with sanctions and all the rest of it. Suddenly that idea evaporated once Putin was charming him. And instead, Trump came out of the ceasefire, out of the summit, I beg your pardon, with the idea that, no, let's not go for a ceasefire. Let's try and wrap this whole thing up, because we've spoken about this before. One of the things getting in the way of the ceasefire was the big question about what happens on the day after. So let's try and get to all those fundamental issues and sort them out. Now, because these issues are big and complex and have been the subject of this war for years, that isn't going to happen quickly. And of course, you can argue that Russia is pushing away the ceasefire because it's gained an advantage on the battlefield and wants to press that home. So I think that's why there's concern in European capitals. They know that Russia has the advantage now. They worry that Trump has again tilted towards the Kremlin position. And they're worried that Zelensky is going to come under a lot of pressure from Trump.
Well, I mean, that's interesting. I mean, we'll come on to that, you know, the Russia's advantages on the battlefield, recent advantages on the battlefield in a moment. With all those European leaders being in attendance in the White House today, then, do you think, should we see them as being there because of their keenness to defend Ukraine from Russia, or are they there to defend Zelensky from Donald Trump?
Well, it's both, isn't it? I mean, I was looking at some stuff that was coming out of the White House yesterday about whether these meetings will be sequential with Zelensky on his own, or whether, you know, this posse of people who want to protect him, the leaders, will be able to get in there with him. I'm not sure it's the second of those alternatives. So, and you can imagine that a sort of 7-way meeting or something in which you've got the leaders of UK, France, you know, NATO, the EU, Germany, and all these folk in with Zelensky is going to be a pretty cumbersome thing to manage. So I'm not actually sure that they'll all be sitting in the room together, but we'll see. Look, it's very tricky. I think the key reason they're going is to prevent Zelensky either being sort of publicly roughed up in the way he was by Trump in February, or, you know, to prevent a sort of public coercive stance being taken. And what will worry them is the president's post on social media overnight that Zelensky could stop this, you know, pretty much any time he wants, is sort of the Trump message. Which, you know, the answer is, well, possibly he could, but only by terms that would resemble capitulation.
Well, so look, as we understand it, Vladimir Putin has demanded the Donbass in return for peace. And as we at least hear from all Ukrainian voices, including on this show, not only would Ukraine be unwilling to deliver that, Ukraine is unable to deliver that because there would have to be a referendum and it wouldn't pass and so on. What seems possible in the realms of the possible? What could happen here? You know, there was that talk last week about the West Bank style deal for occupation that didn't involve surrender and so on. What could conceivably come out of this that could lead to a ceasefire?
Yeah, well, look, if we'd been talking about this a couple of weeks ago, and obviously we have spoken about it quite a bit over the months, I would have argued that the way you try and end this, if that's what you sincerely wanted to do, is to build out from a ceasefire and to accept that the forces have stopped where they've stopped as a result of these years of war, and accept that this was the reality rather than the legal underlying position on sovereignty. I think the West Bank example is unfortunate for various reasons. I wouldn't quite choose that language. But in other words, the idea is you draw the line where the front line is now. You say, no, we know that Ukraine insists that these lands occupied by Russia are Ukrainian lands, and we don't negotiate away the sovereignty of those lands. Now, if you do that, it is obviously considerably easier politically for Zelensky. It's not to say it is easy, but it's easier than any deal that appears to resolve definitively the question of who those lands belong to. And so the constitutional provision in Ukraine against giving away territory, for example, doesn't come into play in a solution in which you say, look, we accept the Russians are there, but Ukraine maintains its claim to the sovereignty of those lands. So, it's still politically very difficult for Zelensky, I would say, to go along with that, but it's more feasible than saying Putin wants the sort of Donbass districts of Luhansk and Donetsk in their entirety sort of gift wrapped, and Crimea, of course, with their sovereignty, which is extremely hard for any Ukrainian leader for a whole lot of reasons to agree to.
So look, as we understand it, Putin claimed to Trump that his forces are about to make some huge military breakthrough in the Donbass anyway, and Zelensky told Trump, no, that's nonsense, don't believe it. In your understanding, what's the reality there? How bad is the situation for the Ukrainians? Is Putin, for once, telling the truth?
Well, once again, without wishing to make out that our conversations are some kind of great piece of record.
Mark, if
you'd asked me this, shocking that I should say such a thing. If you'd asked me this a few months ago, I would have said, look, the clear reality ever since the failure of the Ukrainian attempt to retake a lot of land, which was 2 years ago, is stalemate. Now, actually, the truth is that the Russians have slowly but incrementally been nibbling away, a few miles here, a few miles there. It's very slow and at a huge cost in casualties. I think in the last month or two, things have changed a bit, and to the disadvantage of Ukraine. The Russians seem to have perfected some changes to their tactics and their system of war that are that mean it's working better for the Russian army. Now, the Russian army obviously has a big superiority in numbers, and that's been the case for years. And so the Ukrainians have had to rely on their ingenuity and their creativity in how to stop them. And the fact that in where we are at the moment in warfare, it's kind of easier to defend than to attack because of all the forms of fire you can bring on anybody who attempts to come forward and take your positions. The situation now is the Russians seem to have adopted some new tactics and new ideas, really ever since they pushed the Ukrainian salient into Russia around Kursk out a couple of months ago. They've been working on these tactics. And early last week, they yielded what some people called a breakthrough. Now, the Ukrainians have said, well, no, actually, this advance of several miles in the Donbass has now been dealt with. The Russian forces have been mopped up, panic over sort of thing. But I think there is pretty deep concern among the Ukrainian military and their supporters, the people advising them, in Western militaries, for example, and military contractors and people who are there, I think there is pretty deep concern that the combination of this new Russian tactical approach and the fact that the Ukrainian troops are so thin on the ground, relatively speaking, along this 1,000 kilometers of front, there just aren't enough of them. And the underlying issue, which has been there for the past at least 18 months, that the Ukrainians have just not dealt with the issue of recruitment of soldiers well enough.
But the tactics you're talking about. You've written about this in the Sunday Times, and I'd very much advise people should read it. But it basically seems to involve the Russians sending very expendable troops in to locate enemy positions by being shot at and perhaps by being killed, and then having identified those positions, they attack them with drones. So Russia just has this huge amount of manpower that it doesn't mind sacrificing, right?
Indeed, roughly treble. I mean, they are recruiting soldiers at treble the rate that the Ukrainians are able to, and in rough terms, they have about three times the number of frontline units. And the system that I wrote about in the Sunday Times is essentially to say, look, if your Ukrainian troops are so thin on the ground, and that's 10 or 12 per kilometre of frontage, in maybe 3 or 4 positions or bunkers along that frontage. If you infiltrate troops around those bunkers in small numbers, this is what they've been doing in recent weeks, then those Ukrainian troops either open fire on those Russians, in which case they've given away their position, and then, as you say, the drones or the glide bombs come in and just take out that bunker, or they let the Russians pass, in which case the Russians are then beginning to infiltrate their line. Now, these types of actions have been going on. At times, the Ukrainians apparently have been ordering their soldiers not to shoot at the Russian infiltrators coming through the forward lines, precisely because they reveal their positions. And if one of those positions with 3, 4, whatever Ukrainian soldiers in it is taken out by a glide bomb, and the Russians have been dropping literally thousands of those along the Donbass front line during the past month or two, then it leaves a gap.
Yeah.
Well, and then the Russians can send through what they did about 10 days ago with hundreds of troops to try and consolidate and advance. Now, it hasn't exactly worked for them, but there is a lot of concern in Ukrainian military circles that if the Russians use these tactics simultaneously in many places and stretch the Ukrainian reserves to getting them to commit them in certain places, while they try to infiltrate and exploit in others, that there are going to be significant problems in the weeks and months ahead for the Ukrainian military. So it is quite a difficult time. We could be at a bit of a pivot point in the conduct of the war, and it's kind of doubly significant because it comes at this moment that Putin persuaded Trump to give up the idea of a ceasefire, which would have frozen everything where it is right now, and instead to allow the Russians effectively weeks or months more in which to try and press this advantage on the ground.
Well, so look, finally, Mark, then, just briefly before I let you go, is this the context in which we should be seeing what's happening today then? It's not about what Trump wants, what Putin wants. It's really about Ukraine's fear that if they don't make peace sometime soon or find some kind of way in order to reduce conflict sometime soon, they could be in a lot of trouble militarily.
Yeah, and I think that's right. And I think everything... We can understand how deeply things have changed in the past months or year by the fact that if you look at the first year and a half of the war, Zelensky was the guy who was against a ceasefire on the basis, he said at the time, that it will just freeze in the Russian gains and allow them to keep what they've illegitimately taken. Now, Zelensky is the guy who wants the ceasefire. Yeah. And that tells you where the relative advantage is on the battlefield and, of course, to an extent, in the Oval Office.
Well, that's pretty bleak. Thank you very much indeed. That is Mark Urban, always an essential listen. You can hear him this time every Monday, and you can, of course, read him in the Sunday Times as well. Thank you very much indeed, Mark.